All right, Happy New Year, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kyle Foster, and I'll be moderating today's Artists' Lunch for the International Institute of Astronautical Sciences. If you're joining us for the first time, I'll take a moment to introduce the program. IIAS is a research and education group that is dedicated to the study of the near space environment and beyond. Our mission is to provide a high-value, immersive education within a culturally diverse operational environment that enables citizen science research promoting multinational space exploration, science literacy, and the equitable and peaceful use of outer space. To learn more about IIAS, please visit our website at astronauticsinstitute.org. Today's Artists' Lunch features Adrien Mauduit. Adrien is a French professional astrophotographer and nature cinematographer living in Tromsø in Arctic Norway, right in the middle of the auroral zone. He is the owner of his own award-winning freelancing company called Night Lights Films, specializing in capturing the aurora and anything in the night sky, as well as delivering a broad range of services like photography workshops or advanced space weather and aurora chasing classes. Adrien earned a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science degree in Environmental Sciences in 2012, after which he started teaching advanced science programs in Denmark. That's where he first encountered his love of aurora and fell in love with astrophotography. After countless hours perfecting his craft while getting educated about space, space weather, and the near-Earth environment, as well as atmospheric science, Adrien's goal has been to develop citizen science and science communication through art. His work on noctilucent clouds enabled him to integrate with Project Possum and serve as science communication and EPO coordinator for several projects. Adrien is now deeply involved in familiarizing the public with space weather, as well as popularizing the complex science of auroras amongst the aurora chasing community and beyond. You can find out more about Adrien and his work at www.nightlightsfilms.com or find more links to his work through Linktree at Nightlights Films, all one word. Additionally, you can find out more about Adrien right now through our Artist Lunch. So Adrien, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm not sure I can top this presentation. Thank you so much for presenting who I am, and I'm so thrilled to be here today. And Cal, thank you so much for moderating, and Yvette, thank you so much for organizing as well. And thank you so much for everyone who's attending or who's listening later with the recording. So, okay, so I guess I'm going for a few minutes to talk about myself and how I became a professional astrophotographer and why, you know, the aurora kind of defined a few years ago what I'm doing now for a living. So I am a 32-year-old astrophotographer, originally from the Champagne region in France. So English is not my mother tongue, but I learned English a few years ago in Canada, where I actually completed my master's degree in cooperation with the university that I was in Paris, France, or next to Paris. But just before I continue on this, I want to bring you back to my childhood, because this is exactly where this love for science and space and nature started. So ever since I was little, I always loved being outside, playing with, not so much with my friends. I didn't have that many friends back then. I loved being alone, just exploring nature and, you know, doing experiments or making experiments with nature. I had my own, I remember, what do you call the like aquarium with insects inside, and I had I was growing plants. I had cacti and carnivorous plants. I did a whole bunch of experiments, and I loved observing nature, especially birds and animals. And I guess I was always attracted to space, but you know, it's so much harder when you're a kid, unless you have a telescope or you have access to an astronomy club or something. It's very hard as a kid to sort of get your hands on with space. But I always, you know, more or less had an interest in space as well. And I remember having books in my library about space and the planets and the solar system and everything. So I've always been, yeah, I've always been a huge fan of nature and space. And I remember when I was about 11 years old, my granddad actually gave me as a gift his old Minolta camera, which is an old brand that was bought by Sony a few years ago, actually more than a few years ago, but it doesn't exist anymore. But it was one of those analog cameras or film cameras, and I remember being so thrilled having this camera. And I remember when I first got the camera, I straight away I went to the store and bought my first film to put into the camera, and then started shooting right away. I shot birds, I shot plants, like everything I loved. But then I soon realized it wasn't, only about putting the film into the camera and just hope that the shot would turn out well. You had to learn how to manually expose the shot. So set up your ISO and set up your shutter speed and everything. So there was more to it than I thought. And my first shots were actually quite quite not as good, I would say. So um, as I grew older, I think, and because film was expensive back at the time, when you're a kid, I used to spend my pocket money on this. So I think I left the camera for a long while on the shelf because my hobbies slowly shifted as I became an adolescent, and then as I went through my teenage years, I guess. And so I never really touched a camera until recently, and we're gonna go back to that afterwards. But in the meantime, so I completed my high school degree. Then I did 2 years of special training in. So that's a program that is very specific to France and that cannot be found in the US, for example, or in Canada or anywhere else in the world. I think that's a very advanced program. And by the end of 2 years, you can have access to, you can earn your bachelor's degree in as many disciplines as math, physics, chemistry, biology, and geology. So that's like this combined bachelor's degree, very condensed. Like I used to work 90 hours a week. It was absolutely insane. Um, so I did that for 2 years, earned my bachelor's degree, and then went on to do a master's degree in environmental sciences and ecology. So more towards the natural biological sciences side of the science. And so I decided for my last year before completing the master's degree and the thesis, I decided to travel to Canada to complete where everyone else was still in Paris, like all my fellow friends and students in my class, they decided not to go abroad, and I saw an opportunity to perfect my English and also to experience something else. So I traveled to Canada for a year, and I completed my master's degree doing work on finding alternatives to pesticide in the field. So that was a work that had an agricultural component and also an ecological component. So I sort of mixed the two together to sort of find solutions or find alternatives to pesticides, so towards biological agriculture. So that's what I did my master's degree thesis on, and I completed back in 2012. So I went back to France back then, and earned a special prize as well because the thesis, actually, I didn't know, but the thesis was selected as one of the best in France for this type of work and class. So I received a prize back then, and yeah, that was like the pinnacle of my quote unquote scientific career. So at the same time I co-authored two articles, but then I sort of stopped doing this, especially in this field of science. And when I came back to France, it was actually the time where it was the economical crisis back then. and for some reason, I could not find a job in my branch of research. Like ecology was completely dead. You could not find a job. It was everything. It was like everything was turned towards the economy and not ecology for some reason. So that led me eventually to look for a job for a year, and unfortunately couldn't find anything. And so after a year, I resorted to go to Denmark because we had some friends who offered me a teaching position in a high school in Denmark, which I took without hesitation because that was another experience abroad, and went to teach high school for about 4 years, I would say, from 2013, and that's also where I encountered my first aurora, as Cal was mentioning before. So I remember sitting around the teacher's table or teacher's room, and one of my colleagues, actually back at the time, we were talking about, outdoors and what he was experiencing because he was the cadet teacher at the school, and we were talking about what he was experiencing at night. And we came to talk about the aurora because I told him, well, my biggest dream is to one day see the aurora borealis. And he told me that, well, you know what? You can actually see the aurora from Denmark. And believe it or not, I was quite skeptical because for me, the aurora borealis could only be seen from locations like Iceland, Alaska, Canada, Norway, you name it, but really like the very high latitudes. And Denmark is actually quite low in latitude if you compare it to, I think if I'm not mistaken, it's probably like, I would say it's probably like Maine or something. It's the same latitude as like southern Canada, so it's actually quite low in latitude. But anyway, so one day that there was a geomagnetic storm, so big aurora forecast, or a very very favorable aurora forecast. He told me actually, okay, go to the beach that's facing north tonight and have patience, and maybe you see something. So that's what I did. I waited for maybe 5 hours, very cold on the beach, on the Danish beach on the Baltic Sea, and that was actually very cold. So I decided to give up. And I was just thinking, no, there's just no way you could see the aurora from Denmark. And he just teased me, and that was not true. So remember walking back to the car, and on the opposite side of the parking lot, there was a forest. And on the tree line, I remember I was, not facing the beach anymore, but I was looking at the tree line. And I will always remember this sight actually. I could see the tree line illuminate right away. And obviously, at first I thought it was a car, but it couldn't be a car because, behind me was just the sea. It was nothing else. And so I thought maybe in a split second, I thought maybe that's something like that's the moon, that's dawn, that's, I don't know, that's a boat, something else. And what was my surprise when I turned back and I saw this magnificent display of dancing pillars on the horizon. It was absolutely mesmerizing. And I think I will remember it for the rest of my life. And I think this moment alone single-handedly defined my love for aurora, and sort of rekindled my love for space as well, and for astrophotography. So, and so much so that the next day I actually went to buy my first camera online. And about a week later, I received the camera with the starting kit lens. Did not know anything about taking pictures, and much less at night. So I kind of taught myself very quickly and went back to the beach to capture the aurora. My first shots were absolutely terrible, but I think it really encouraged me to just keep going, keep learning, keep being better at photography. And progressively, I could notice that my passion for astrophotography became more. Like I remember spending more time in astrophotography than I did in my job, which is probably not a good thing, right? So much so that I decided to actually quit the job that I had at the school and go back to France and take a new turn and start a new adventure. So I started my own company in France as a freelance photographer. And I traveled different places in the world. I traveled to the Canary Islands. I traveled to Chile. I traveled to South Africa, but also Sweden, Iceland, and different locations. And it didn't really work for me the first year because when you don't have a name, it's a bit hard to get started in this very saturated market, especially with social media. It's very hard to get through and to really go through that ceiling that every photographer or newbie photographer, aspiring photographer, I should say, has. But anyways, I decided to take a last trip before I sort of gave up. And that last trip was in Lapland in Sweden. And believe it or not, while I was in Sweden, I got contacted by the owner of the Aurora Borealis Observatory in Norway, which I had no idea about. He invited me for a talk and just to show me around. So I booked a trip, last-minute trip to cross the border to Norway and visited the observatory, and I just fell in love with the place. So much so that they actually, the owner actually invited me to work for them at the observatory. And so that completely saved my quote unquote short career because I was just about to give up, and then that was the helping hand that I needed to jumpstart that career, really, to start anew. And so that allowed me to build my content, work as a guide back there, and yeah, just get started as a photographer. And now I am a full-time freelancer photographer, and I work for my own company. So I stopped at the observatory, but I now work in Tromsø full-time, and I live under the aurora. So exactly what Kyle said earlier, I offer all those kinds of services, and I just love what I do. I live for the aurora. This is the really, the centerpiece of my life, and what I really want to develop, in citizen science and in all the organizations that I work with and all the people that I work with. So I hope that was like a comprehensive little intro of myself.
That was fantastic, and honestly, it's a very captivating story. It's a very compelling story because you've got a very rich background. And honestly, I'd like to lead off with a question that actually springs from your background. You told us briefly about the Minolta camera that you received from your grandfather. I'm wondering if you have a favorite camera that you use for shooting aurora, or do you have a series of different cameras that you cycle through?
All right, so some of them are on display here, but I do have my go-to camera for astrophotography, but I have a favorite camera for filming, and I have a favorite camera for taking stills. And they're not the same camera, obviously, because the manufacturers, they don't want to produce this one camera that does everything. While there are some cameras that do sort of everything, but I'm just not like that. It's not for my taste. Like I like a particular kind of shot for my stills, and I like a particular style for my videos. So for video recording at night, I do prefer the Sony cameras, especially the A7S series. So A7S1, 2, and 3, those are absolutely incredible for recording at night. They allow you or the users to really crank up the ISO without worrying about having much noise. If you know about photography, usually the more you higher that ISO value, generally speaking, the more noise you're going to get, especially for real time, because your shutter speed is very low. So cranking up your ISO will result in a lot of noise. So these cameras can handle the high ISO pretty well without having necessarily to do a lot of noise reduction in post-process. So this is what I like for recording. And for stills, you know what? A lot of people think for astrophotography that you need the most the best camera, the best performing camera, the most expensive. And it's actually not true. You need a camera that can also handle high ISOs, but also have the nice, like the, I would say, a nice amount of number of pixels to sort of give you the best signal to noise. And that's not necessarily the cameras that have the highest pixel count. It's actually cameras that have about 12, 20, 24 megapixels. Those are actually the best cameras. And my all-time favorite camera is the Canon 6D. Now it's very cheap because it's still a DSLR. It's not even a mirrorless. It's like a very old camera. I think it dates back to 2007 or 9, if I remember well. So that's quite an old camera. As opposed to what we get now. But you can find those for quite cheap and they perform. I mean, I'm still delivering to clients right now with these cameras. So again, it's not necessarily about the price. It's not necessarily about it being new. It's about your camera giving the best signal to noise, like the best detail and the least noise. And this camera actually performs and outperforms a lot of other cameras on the market.
Excellent. So you mentioned a couple technical terms there, and I know that we might have a mixed audience here. So ISO, you mentioned that is related to the sensitivity of your detector, and so higher ISO is more sensitive, so you can look at dimmer things, but you might get more noise.
Actually, if I can just interject real quickly. So
sure.
I think sensitivity is the word that a lot of people use, but I think the most correct term is amplification. It's pretty much like you're in your living room and you want to amplify the volume of the music that you're listening to, and you just crank up that little amp volume thing. That is exactly what ISO is. But that's for light. That's not for sound. That's just for light signal. So ISO, cranking up the ISO is just like dialing up that dial of volume, if you will.
Right. So to control your exposure, you have ISO, you have your aperture, which is basically how much light is entering your camera, and you have your shutter speed, which is how long are you letting light into your camera. Do you have a particular combination of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO that you find works best for astrophotography and aurora photography, or do you like to mix things up depending on what sort of ambiance that you're trying to produce in your art?
So that's a very good question. I wouldn't say there is I have a go-to setting or set of settings, but I would say there are definitely settings that I would sort of go back to if I'm shooting a specific subject or if I'm shooting like a specific scene. So there are a few things to know, for example, about aurora. If you're shooting aurora, for example, it depends on the strength of the aurora and how fast it's moving. Obviously, the faster it's moving, the less blurry you're gonna want your photo to be, because when the aurora goes so fast, sometimes it just, even real time is too fast for the aurora. So if you take a 10-second exposure on that picture, the aurora will look very blurry and you're going to have a really hard time catching those very defined structures like pillars and bands and everything. So when you're dealing with fast moving auroras, you really want to dial down that shutter speed to sometimes 1 second and even faster than that. Versus if you have an aurora that's very faint and that's quite, not fast moving, you can let the shutter speed take in as much light as possible without worrying about, it being blurry. And if you're shooting things like Milky Way, you have time. Like the Milky Way, depending on where you are on Earth, of course, but the Milky Way doesn't move as fast as the aurora. So you can easily let, your shutter speed open or your shutter open for 10, 15, 20 seconds, depending on the field of view that you have, so that the focal length that you have. If you have a very wide focal length, 14 millimeters, for example, 20 millimeters, you can let your shutter open for, let's say, 20 seconds easily without worrying about the rotation of the Earth, and the picture being blurry as a result. So I would say there are definitely, like, I would say, I hate saying this term because there's nothing wrong in photography. Photography is art. So it's hard to say there is something wrong. It's not science, it's not science, it's art. But if you're looking for a specific ambiance, like you were saying, or specific visual result, then yes, you definitely need to adopt a few settings. So there are definitely settings that you won't use. Otherwise, you will not achieve this specific atmosphere in your photos.
Very good. We have our first question from the chat, coming from Yvette Gonzalez. Is there a photo that you consider to be an inflection point in your career, one that really changed your game? And I'll add to that question, was it a single photo, or was it maybe a series of photos? And tell us more.
Yeah, so actually I'm just sharing my screen right now, and this is just part of that photo. So believe it or not, that's not a photo of the aurora, but that is that's my background. That's the background of my wallpaper of my computer, and so that's a picture of the Milky Way, and I took it in 2019, just before COVID hit. I was on La Palma Island, and I decided to take something. Actually, I might have that photo in the full photo, the full res photo, because obviously this is not just the sky that I took. I took a panorama as well with the foreground, and my goal was to take a photo of the Milky Way that has the best resolution possible and still includes the foreground. So this alone that you're seeing here is actually 55 photos together, stitched together. So this is one. Oh, sorry, I'm just opening my. Sorry, I didn't get this this photo ready, but
Wow.
I'm gonna try and find and browse through the photos that I have. Yeah, this is the photo. It's going to take a little bit of time to load because it's such a heavy file. And so this is a 73 picture or 73 panel panorama. So this photo is 73 pictures stitched together back to back or side by side. And it took me about 2 hours to take for each photo. And then it took me days to post-process this picture, to put everything together, to sort of very zoom in and do the work on all the nebulae in the sky, all the stars that you see. It's very blurry now because it's such a heavy file that it takes so much time to process the resolution and show you a clear picture. But very heavy picture, and this is like this is the picture that I'm most proud in my career, because this is such an achievement. There is something that has never been done before, to my knowledge. Taking that much resolution in the sky, plus the original foreground where the Milky Way was exactly standing from the exact same spot of the tripod, and not like compositing the picture with a foreground that wasn't there or anything. It was exactly how it was. So yeah, that's the shot.
that is truly stunning. So I have a couple technical questions about this, and I'm going to put on my nerd hat for this.
Right.
So 2 hours, that's an appreciable amount of time wherein the Earth is going to rotate, and so the sky is going to have apparent motion. So when you stitch together this mosaic, is that all done solely in post-processing, or at time of capture were you planning out certain azimuth and elevation angles for your captures? How much of this was done before, like how much of this was done like at the eyepiece versus how much was done at the computer afterwards?
Right. So that's an excellent question too, because it takes a lot of planning for this shot, and everything has to come together. And it took me I remember going to La Palma in 2017 for the first time, and I already had the idea of the shot. Like I took a few years to plan this shot and see what was possible, where it was possible. And even then, when I came up there, there was so much wind because it's at 2,500 meters. So in feet, that's, just can't remember, that was what,
It's high.
10,000, something like that.
Yeah.
So that's in altitude. So I had to deal with altitude sickness, mosquitoes. Believe it or not, it's very dry, but there are tons of mosquitoes. So when you're trying to pan the camera, lots of mosquitoes to deal with. Wind, which, when you're at that focal length, which was 135, so that's very zoomed in for astrophotography, and you're on a very sort of, I wouldn't say fragile, but a very unstable sort of ground, and you have this very big rig that you have with the tracker and everything. So the slightest movement with the breeze, or the wind, I should say, because that wasn't just the breeze, that was the wind. And anything can go wrong basically. And I actually had to retake some of the shots because they were a bit blurry. But so I started there, like I started with the sky. I took one picture, then I manually adjusted, following the stars in the viewfinder, the shot above, and then I did a column of about 10 shots. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then I switched to this column, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc., 10, and I did like a snake sort of motion,
like a raster back and forth.
knowing that the Milky Way obviously is going from left to right here. So I started here because this part of the sky is setting, while this is south. So at this area of the Earth, the Milky Way goes like this. It just rises here and sets there. So I started there so that I got this part of the sky before it set. And then I went up and down and up and down and up and down. And then in post-process, I had to subtract what we call calibration frames. So I took calibration frames, dark frames, bias frames, and flat frames for the very technical, if some of you are technical, that allowed me to get better signal to remove lens aberrations and stuff like that. And yeah, I did all the coloring, all the contrast adjustments, all the curve adjustments in post-process, but that took me a while to get educated about what software to use to process such a massive panorama, because that's 6 gigabyte unprocessed. So even Photoshop cannot take that much data, basically. So yeah, that's a big project and big results.
That is absolutely incredible. So that actually leads me to my next question. So if I want to get started with astrophotography or with aurora photography, do I have to hike to the top of a mountain? What goes into finding a good location to photograph aurora or to conduct astrophotography?
So actually, I would say astrophotography is even more accessible than what you think, because even with a starting kit lens and starting kit camera, any camera basically that you can put on a tripod and it can manually adjust your settings, you can do astrophotography. Of course, the more I would say not specialized, but the pictures that you get with the starting kit lenses, for example, the ones with the apertures that the minimum apertures that have I think f4 or something like that, those will not give you the best results because obviously you want the aperture to be lower than that, at least the native aperture to be lower than that. But it doesn't take that much to scout for a location that is nice, where you can see the Milky Way. I recommend you to look at, I think it's www.lightpollutionmap.com, or you can just Google light pollution map to get out of light pollution. Look at where the Milky Way is. You can use a series of apps to do that. I personally use, I think this free app is really, really good. It is called Sky Guide. I can put it in the chat if you want. It's a very cool app. that lets you use the compass of your phone, and you just point your phone at the sky, and it just reveals all the objects, where the moon is located, where the Milky Way is located, and you can find objects like that. So let me just sky guide, put it in the chat. Oops, no, that's not what I want.
Yep, I'm frantically grabbing links as well.
Sky guide, and so yep, so you can use this, and also yeah, be careful of your environment because you're evolving in the dark. That's why I'm urging you to scout during the day to sort of identify the hazards and the potential dangers in the field, especially if you're like in a national park. Can't stress enough that it's dangerous even during the day, so at night it's even more dangerous. So take the necessary precaution, take lots of warm clothing, sorry, take food and drinks, and remember the tripod. I think that's something that a lot of people, yeah, I did that at first. I did not realize that since your shutter speed is going to be for several seconds, for example, like long, if you move the camera during that time, you're going to get blurry pictures, right? So you need a tripod to fix your camera to, so that the camera stays still during that shutting, during that shutter speed, during that exposure time. I know a lot of cameras do self-timer mode, so you don't need a remote control to action your camera. You can just, because obviously triggering the shutter will introduce a bit of jitter, so you want to avoid that. So put your camera on self-timer mode. 2 or 5 seconds is enough to keep the camera still for that the time that you press the shutter, and then take the photo. And also remove the strap around the camera, which flaps in the wind and also introduces jitter as well. So those are the small things that you don't necessarily think about when you think astrophotography to start with. And those are the mistakes that I made at first.
So in addition to the tripod, is there a piece of equipment that you find absolutely vital when you're in the field?
So yes, so you really want to get as wide as possible to start with. I think when you're beginning in astrophotography, you really want those lenses that open wide and that also open with a very wide aperture. So you want to be looking for as low a focal length as possible. Ideally, I would say 14 mil, 16 mil, 20 mil to start with is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And you want that aperture, that native aperture, so minimal aperture, to be that f number to be as low as possible as well. Don't worry about, just put it at the lowest possible and then go wide, because remember the Earth is rotating during that exposure time as well. So it's not that you can expose for an infinite number of seconds or minutes, right? Because over a certain number of seconds, your stars are going to start trailing in the sky, and they're going to get blurry. So since most people, unless you're doing a star trail, which is actually quite cool, most people want their stars to be sharp and their Milky Way to be sharp in the sky. So if you don't want that, there's a rule that's called the 500 rule, and that says the maximum exposure time that you can get for the focal length of the lens is 500 divided by your focal length, and that gives you approximately the maximum shutter speed that you can use. Be careful though, that rule is approximative because it depends on where you are on the planet, and some lenses are a bit more than 14, for example. If you buy a 14, it's a bit more than 14. Some cameras are also crop sensors, so that depends. And to answer your question directly, my favorite piece of equipment that I like to take additionally in the field with me is a small star tracker. So to avoid, to go over that exposure time, that limit that I just told you about, there is a way, and is to buy a little device that compensates for the rotation of the Earth, and that's called a star tracker. And it does what the name suggests, actually. It just tracks the stars so that you follow the stars so the stars stay nice and sharp in the picture.
So it's a device that kind of couples to the camera mount.
Exactly. You
Okay.
place on the tripod first, and then you place the camera. I think usually with a ball head on top of the tracker, and then you just fix the camera to that ball head, and then you can just adjust where you shoot. I definitely recommend the Vixen Polari, or there's another one called the Star Adventurer Mini or Pro that I'm putting here in the, oh, sorry for my spelling, Star Adventurer.
No worries.
So those are like the very good, a very good place to start if you really want those star to be sharp. And yeah, that's my favorite piece of equipment to. I have it also when I do aurora shots, because I can use those to do a panning motion as well when I do time lapses. So you can kill two birds with one stone doing that. That's perfect.
Excellent. We have a couple more questions from the chat. First up from Sucheshna Patil, a hardware question, asking which lenses from Canon are better for astrophotography. Sucheshna has a 200 millimeter.
Okay, so if funny enough, Canon has an excellent range of lenses for wildlife, sports, landscapes, obviously. But for astrophotography, I'm actually regretting to say that they do not have the best lenses. They're very expensive, and they're definitely outperformed by a lot of other third-party manufacturers and other brands. So if you take, for example, the Canon 24mm 1.4, which should be very good for astrophotography, right? Because of low aperture, wide aperture and quite wide angle. But if you look at the stars in your pictures, they're going to be at 1.4 aperture at least. They're going to be very weird. They're going to look very elongated, especially in the corners, and we call that astigmatism. And that will actually degrade the picture quite a lot. So the quality of your picture will actually be, compared to other lenses, not that good. And plus, they're double the price sometimes than other lenses that perform much better. So I would rather you used an adapter and then buy a third-party lens. I would definitely advise you to look into Sigma, Rokinon, Samyang. Those offer, or Loa. Those manufacturers offer very reasonable prices and excellent lenses for astrophotography. I personally go with Sigma. That you can see here, I have tons of Sigma lenses. They're half the price of the Canon lenses, and they're actually much sharper than the Canon lenses.
Good tip. Awesome. A couple community questions from Yvette. I'll turn this into a two-parter. Says Yvette, I didn't know about the aurora's existence until I was 18 or 19 years old. How do you think we can make aurora photography or astrophotography more accessible to youth? And what role do you think that the people who capture these images have in STEAM, so science, technology, engineering, art, and math?
All right, so I'm gonna try and answer the first question, and then if I remember, then I'll ask you again if I don't remember, Kyle.
We'll allow that.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I'm just looking at one of the questions. Sorry. Yes, the how to make astrophotography more accessible. Sorry, aurora photography and education, I guess, more accessible to youth. And I would love for the classrooms to include, or at least like the textbooks, to include a little bit about the aurora. I don't think there's anything. I think I used to teach personally a lot about the aurora when I was in Denmark, and when I went back to France afterwards, I used to be substitute teacher for my dad's school in high school, and I was in charge of the physics classes. And I remember doing like a whole bunch of things about the aurora, how to explain the different colors, have a very visual approach about the aurora, how to explain the electromagnetic spectrum through the aurora. I think that's like a marvelous natural phenomenon that you can use for education. But as for solution for photography, I don't know. I think I should personally encourage younger people to start shooting the aurora through my photography. So that's why I keep posting on social media so that, hopefully more people, and eventually also by extension, by proxy, more youth can, or more young people can, look at those photos and say, hey, maybe that's possible for me to get out there, get my first camera, get out there and shoot aurora. I also wish there was more information available, especially in North America, because you guys in North America are definitely more privileged than us in Europe, for example, for aurora viewing, because the aurora dips more towards the south for you, for the same geographic latitude. So I wish there was more information about this, for example, so that young kids in, I don't know, the Great Lakes area, for example, where the aurora usually dip south more often, could get out there and photograph the aurora.
So,
all right, and the second part of the question, guys, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Sorry.
No worries. What role do aurora photographers and astrophotographers have in STEAM? I think you touched on that a little bit already.
Yeah, I think there's a great part in STEAM for photography, and especially astrophotography. There's just so much about the aurora that we don't know. There's so many phenomena that we still discover to this day. And every year there's a new quote unquote aurora phenomenon that is discovered. And in recent years, actually, there has been a lot of discoveries and a lot of investigation that have been lots of this investigation that has been conducted because of citizen science and because of photographs. Things that even scientists had no idea about before, like the Dunes aurora, that phenomenon, the subarauroral arc, or Steve, maybe you heard about that phenomenon. So lots of things like that have been quote unquote discovered just through photography. So this is very encouraging, and because cameras become more and more affordable, more and more people get cameras in their hands and may capture something that has never been seen before and never experienced before. So this is very encouraging. I think that has a huge role to play in STEAM for sure.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So I see that we're about 53 minutes past the hour, but there's two more topics that I wanted to touch on with you. So first I'll ask, are you okay if we go over on time a little bit?
Sure. I do have a webinar afterwards, but that's in an hour. So I have a bit of time. Maybe we can give 15, 20 minutes more if you don't mind.
Perfect. So the two topics in general that I wanted to talk about are life in the Arctic Circle and then NFTs. We do have some interest expressed in the chat about that. I do want to talk about the Arctic Circle first. What's life like living in the Arctic Circle?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's definitely something that I think gets overlooked, especially because now is actually the time where a lot of the tourists are traveling to Arctic Norway or Arctic Lapland, Sweden or Finland to see the aurora. And I don't think
now for anyone watching the recording later, now being like February, early part of the calendar year.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention it's
no worries.
But yeah, so January, February, March are probably like the peak months for aurora watching at our latitudes, which is 69 degrees north. So that's fairly high in latitude. And even though we benefit from the Gulf Stream, which allows us to have, milder temperature by the coast, if we didn't have that Gulf Stream, it would be absolutely freezing. We would have like the sea would be sea ice. That would be ice, and we would just have freezing temperatures all the time. We do have freezing temperatures all the time, but it's not as bad as people might think. We have a lot of wind, which makes it worse, but it's not as bad as minus, the minus 40, minus 50 Celsius that they get in Canada. That's not as bad as this. But what is worse in a way, I guess, or what more surprising to people when they come here is actually the amount of light. So not necessarily the temperature, but just the amount of light that we get, and the very weird slash beautiful light that we get, because our specific place on Earth allows all the objects in the sky, including the moon and the sun, to have very gentle course, right, when they rotate. So our sunset and our sunrises are not as steep as yours, for example, in the US, or much further south at the equator, where it almost, it's vertical. For us, it's almost horizontal. So it's very gentle. And so that course of the sun is very weird in a way that for 2 months of the year, we actually don't see the sun at all. It just doesn't rises for us. And we just got out of this period, which is called the polar nights. And at the opposite side of the year, in the summertime, we have the midnight sun. So that means the sun never sets at all during the day. So we have 24 hours daytime. And it's actually quite nice to see in the summer. But trust me, after 2 days, you've had enough of the midnight sun. It's a hard life because it just messes up with your biological cycle much more than I had anticipated coming here, actually. The first year was fine, but now the more that I stay here, the bigger toll it takes on me and on my health, I think. Especially the dark time of the year, not necessarily the bright the bright nights in the summer. We can find alternatives, but in the winter time, we do have to find solutions. So I personally take vitamin C and vitamin D as a daily supplement, but I know a lot of people, for example, go to those UV tanning, tubs or whatever they're called. I don't know, solarium, stuff like that. I don't do that because of the risk of cancer, and it's not really good for your skin. And with COVID, anyways, it's not really good. So that's tough. That's something that you need to factor in when you come to live here.
I think it's probably time to talk about NFTs. So to set the tone of the conversation, first let's define what an NFT is. It's a non-fungible token. What does that mean to you, Adrien?
So NFTs are something that I was completely unaware of as of February of last year. And I remember getting into a Clubhouse room, Clubhouse being an app that came out, I think, during the pandemic as a way of, it's an audio app, so as a way of communicating only with audio. And I was in one of those rooms talking about NFTs. I had no idea. And they were talking about gas price. And I was, oh, what's the price of gas in where you're at right now? Not knowing they were not talking about gas for your car, but gas for NFTs. And so all in all, I got to know NFTs better. And I think to give a better picture of what NFTs are, they're just a piece of asset that lives online. So anything that is online can potentially be an NFT. It just lives somewhere special online that's called a blockchain. And a blockchain is something that by principle cannot die, because it's hosted by several blocks or people or computers, if you will, that operate that blockchain at all times, so that it lives everywhere, basically, like on a network. That's what the blockchain is. And the more blocks that you add to that chain, the more the less likely that that piece of asset or that whole world will collapse and die. So this is the whole principle, I think, of NFTs. And to me, that sort of revolutionized the way I was looking at the web, because before the NFT world and how it will sort of transition into Web 3, Web 3.0, sorry. Web 2.0 for me was very static and stagnant, especially in the realm of social media. You know, we lived every day to sort of show ourselves, show our lives, you know, post a picture and get likes and get, what's that? Is that dopamine? I can't remember the hormone that you get when when you get likes online. So it was a never-ending cycle and kind of like a vicious circle. For me. And I was really looking for something else, especially because I was in the world of art as well. So I was really expecting something more out of my photography and film. And I feel like the NFT world has not only revolutionized that view for me, but also has given me an opportunity, another platform, if you will, to show my art and host my art.
Okay. Um, what so my understanding is that you're offering some of your art as NFTs. What drives your decision to take that as a course of selling your art versus selling standalone prints or selling copies of the digital images directly or selling your imagery as stock photography? What drives the economic decision for you there?
Right. So there are different aspects, I think, to, I think as a photographer and as an artist, you need to always weigh the pros and the cons, and of course, financially, but also what that represents for your brand, right? And as you, but for you as a photographer. So I personally have both as of now. Like I haven't fully transitioned into NFTs. I still have my print store. Um, so you know, some people might argue that it's you know it's completely bad for the environment because on the one hand I sell prints and I ship prints and that has like a big carbon footprint, and on the other side I do NFTs, which might people argue also that might have a big carbon footprint. Um, but I'm not fully transitioned into NFTs because I like the way NFTs um, kind of host your asset only online, and it can be just owned by someone versus the print. I'd love to have still the possibility to ship a print to someone because that's something that NFTs I think will never sort of replace. Is that is the physical thing that you can touch, right? And I think that's dear to a lot of photographers still, to be able to print out their pictures and really like physically send it to someone rather than you know having that same piece, that same photo on a computer or on the phone or even on an iframe that you have on the wall or on a screen. It just for me, it just I'm still here in between two worlds. I like both of those worlds. So I'm not sure when or if I'm going to fully transition into NFTs, but I'm not gonna stop NFTs because I do think it's partly the future of art, in my opinion.
I see. Um, you've been involved with a number of different citizen science research efforts related to the aurora, and I'm curious about what impact you might perceive or maybe don't see with respect to NFTs and the research community. So if you have a stunning example of some aurora phenomenon that ends up in a piece of your artwork that gets sold as an NFT, um, what impact does that have on the research community? Can they still use that imagery in their research, or do they then have to purchase it? Is it like a data embargo from like you would see from a space telescope, or is it a non-issue?
Yeah, that's a subject that's really up in the air at the moment. Actually, I missed that space, fortunately, that Twitter space the other day. But they were specifically talking about implementing and or using NFTs in the scientific world, and I know it's a subject that is being talked about. So NFTs, as in not only art, but also use NFTs for other branches of or services like tourism and obviously science, as you mentioned. Um, I personally don't have a real life example to give you. I don't think maybe it's been done before. I'm just not aware of it right now. Um, but I know, for example, there is a friend of mine who is doing citizen science on sprites, which are a transient luminous event in the upper atmosphere in about the mesosphere. And he photographs that phenomenon for I wouldn't say for a living. I think it's a hobby which has become sort of a side gig for him, I think. And he's offering actually these images as NFTs. So I yet have to talk to him about how he can involve that into the citizen science part of his research, because I think he works in tandem with scientists in the university in Colorado, or just kind of there's a physics institute in Colorado, or the physics department that's quite famous for those phenomena. And other than that, I personally don't know. I think we talked a little bit about it, Kyle. Um, there might be a future. I just don't see it right now. But it's just a personal view. Maybe it's the fact that I'm short-sighted about this. I don't know. As of now, I think it has a very good place in art. Science, maybe, but there's, like you mentioned, there's going to be you know, conflict of interest maybe about who's owning the data, and if someone else is owning the data, the scientists are involved in the paper, for example, that the study, will they still have access to that set of data, or how is it going to be controlled? So there's still a lot of questions up in the air. I just wish I was able to attend that space because that was really interesting. But I think there's going to be other spaces in the future.
Absolutely. It's certainly a topic for ongoing debate. Well, I would like to be respectful of your time. I truly appreciate all the time and knowledge and just beautiful images that you've shared with us today, Adrien. Do you have any parting thoughts or parting words for us before we wrap things up today?
Oh, yes. So I do have a few words. So first and foremost, before I get to this, I want to thank Kyle and Yvette and every one of you who attended. It was a pleasure for me, and I really hope I sparked an interest in the aurora or any type of astrophotography. I didn't show you a lot of um, the the pictures of the aurora that I took, but you can see some of them are behind me that are framed. And I do hope that if the aurora is on your bucket list, it shouldn't be on your bucket list anymore. It's something that you ought to see. It really is. It's something that has, I know, I'm speaking from personal experience, it personally changed my life, but having dealt with clients and tourists coming to me to experience the aurora, I can assure you there in the 5 years I've done this, there's no one has ever regretted seeing the Northern Lights or has been very disappointed to see the Northern Lights, even though sometimes you can't really see that many colors. But it's a phenomenon that is here. It happens all the time. So yeah, if you have this item on your bucket list, I cannot recommend enough to cross it off as soon as possible.
Truly wonderful. Adrien, thank you so much. Once again, for those in our audience, you can find out more about Adrien and his work at www.nightlightsfilms.com, or find more links to his work through his link tree at Nightlights Films, all one word. Again, From all of us here at the International Institute for Astronautical Sciences, we wish you clear skies, and you can learn more about our program at astronauticsinstitute.org. I'm Kyle Foster. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a good day.